right. So this week we're starting Orwell's 1984. We're basically spending the entire week on it. It's 2 days. Um, uh, it's an interesting kind of bridge book, I suppose. It's been in the news a lot over the last 5 or 6 years, just because of what's going around the world politically, what's been going on around the world technologically, etc. Now, there are analogies between the book and all of this, but there's also some pretty significant disanalogies, and we'll kind of go over some of that stuff. Reading comprehension quiz 8. It's going to be on 1984. I think I'm going to postpone the reflection paper, number 4. We'll have that, I think, due next week, because I want to kind of maybe combine some stuff from 1984 and maybe some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about a little later on. And also, just to give ourselves a little bit of a breather. I have put an announcement on D2L. Basically, it concerns contact policies for me and the TAs. Look at that. I'm going to email it out also to everybody, just because I know people get their information from in different ways at different times, et cetera, et cetera. And I have posted the final grade, or whatever you want to call it, for the midterm. I haven't changed your grade in the D2L grade book, because for some reason, whenever I try that, it like screws the entire grade book up. But I have put that in there in the like a feedback box. That's what it looks like to me anyway. So if you can go in there and look at your feedback, I think that should give you your real grade, which I have in my Excel grade book that I keep for myself, for that, which is the actual final grade for the course. Any questions about any of that stuff? Administrative type stuff. All right, so if there's no questions, we'll just kind of get into this. I found this picture. I don't know where exactly. I mean, obviously it was on the internet, but it's a pretty interesting picture because what it is basically, it's a graphic that combines images from the film 1984, from the year 1984, with obviously Mark Zuckerberg and a little Facebook thumbs up thing, a like button. I guess what the artist here is trying to convey is somehow that there's a relationship between what Facebook has been doing, again, probably inadvertently, its effect on democracy and some of the issues raised in 1984. And we'll look at some of those. Again, there are disanalogies, even though there are some analogies between what's going on in the book and what's going on sort of in the world of social media. One of the things that I want to look at too is sort of a general, or some general sort of philosophical questions that are used in the book, and that I think are also relevant to some questions about the social media world, the technology-driven world that we currently occupy. So just a couple of leading questions before we kind of get into some of the issues here. One thing, and this is a pretty prominent question in the book, I think, is under what circumstances should we doubt something, right? Doubt is obviously something that we deal with every day, right? You might doubt that your friend is telling the truth. You might doubt something that you see on the news. And of course, you might doubt stuff that you're reading on social media, right? Doubt is always there. So the question then is, under what circumstances is it, I suppose, appropriate to doubt something? What are the kinds of claims that we should doubt? And these are, of course, just quite the kinds of questions that you would raise and run into in in different kinds of philosophy courses. Just a few examples. The most obvious one, I think, is when should we, doubt our senses, right? Our senses obviously can mislead us sometimes. The classic example is you see a stick in a bucket of water or a pencil in a glass of water. It looks bent, right? Now there's, the science people are going to tell you exactly why that is, but our senses don't exactly, or at least sight as a sense doesn't, as it were, give us the reality, give us the true picture. But, you can come up with any number of different kinds of examples, like, for example, just seeing a hallucination or a mirage, or when you're drunk or on drugs, right? Any of these kinds of things kind of screw up with the senses. How exactly might we correct these doubts, right? So if I have a doubt about something, what's the best way to go about ensuring myself, perhaps, whether I am in fact being tricked, right? So the issue here is, once you kind of go on this this trail, which can turn into a rabbit hole of some sorts, you tend to get more skeptical about what you can actually believe, and that, I think that can snowball. And of course, what's going to happen in this book is that part of the reason I think that the party can gain control like this, and I think part of Orwell's whole, philosophical background here, is that this kind of stuff can happen. Doubts can snowball, and then what's the political consequences of that? Should we doubt claims that fail to cohere with our background beliefs, right? Everybody has a set of background beliefs that you basically just default to when somebody tells you something. Does this, it's automatic, right? Does this claim, comport with what I have experienced throughout my life? Now, of course, everybody's born into different circumstances, so everybody has different background beliefs. And you can, think about these in a lot of different ways. Background beliefs, say, from your family, but, larger, your city, your community, your church group, your class, your ethnicity, your sex, your gender. All of these sorts of things have some sort of influence on this set of background beliefs, where you were born, when you were born, that kind of stuff. Now, the question, of course, is, well, what if our background beliefs are wrong? That's not a popular thing to say in a class like this, that such beliefs can be wrong, but of course they can, right? Of course, any belief that you have might be wrong, especially if it has to do with, say, the outside world. Things become a little bit less clear when we're talking about different kinds of beliefs, such as 2 + 2 = 4, right? Is it possible to doubt that kind of belief? Let's just say that some of your background beliefs, the beliefs that you grew up with, let's just say, are in fact inaccurate or wrong. Would further beliefs of some sort be able to correct these? Now, once you start going on this little, philosophical journey, as it were, down this rabbit hole, some philosophers become extreme skeptics. Now, what's interesting, at least from my perspective, is that some of these sort of legitimate philosophical questions that you get in, Philosophy 101 or any number of kind of philosophy classes, they're actually exploited by the party in 1984. And what's really interesting to me, anyway, is that you can kind of see some of this stuff happening right now in our world, right? That's probably one reason, at least, why 1984, in the last few years or so, has become popular again, right? Just this kind of political element to our use of technology, to our politics in general. Again, it's not exactly like this. Orwell was writing at a time of a different kind of totalitarianism. So one question that we want to think about is, does it really require that level of sort of extreme totalitarianism to gain control over a society in at least somewhat similar ways that they're doing in the book? Do you need a Big Brother type character in that respect? And I think that that's kind of the interesting question contemporarily, at least, right? We have a different world right now than when he was writing this back in, the 40s or whatever. But I think we can connect it to some of those issues. Going along these lines, now, one thing to note, these are epistemological questions. And what that means is they're questions about our beliefs and our knowledge. What can we know? What does it mean to know something? What does it mean to have evidence for something? What does it mean for something to be true, for example? Now, so one question then is, does an absolute sense of, conviction underlie any sort of political totalitarianism? Just a couple of examples, right? A pure belief in the cause, an underlying loyalty to the party. Do you have to have this conviction, this unwavering conviction, in order for this kind of totalitarian control over society to be effective? In contrast to this, perhaps, it's not clear, does a global sense of skepticism or doubt, either instead or in addition, underlie this kind of totalitarianism, right? It could be both, right? How exactly would it be both? Well, if there is this underlying global skepticism, in other words, people just don't understand or can't grasp how you can really get to the truth of anything, then that opens the door for kind of irrationality, right? And irrationality sometimes is at the heart of this absolute sense of conviction. You're believing things for reasons other than evidential reasons, as it were. Some of the stuff is in Weston as well. Now, for Orwell, the belief that, and this is a central kind of theme of the novel, the belief that reality is malleable, malleable indeed by our convictions, is what underlies the totalitarianism, at least in this book. What do I mean by reality is malleable by our convictions? Well, essentially, the idea there is whatever convictions you happen to have, that's your reality, right? And those convictions, depending on your cognitive abilities or cognitive states, those convictions can change, under certain circumstances. So the idea here, and I think this is part of what Orwell is toying with a little bit, is that if there is no such thing as truth, right, you just get rid of that concept, then basically any statement becomes merely this noise that you're making, and you can take this idea, these noises, these utterances, as it were, can be used in just any power struggle against any other power struggle. And in fact, the whole concept of truth just becomes a concept of who's stronger, who's beating other people up at the moment, because whatever they're going to say is what we consider, quote unquote, true. Now, I think that that's part of what's going on in Orwell's, the kind of background element in Orwell's story here. Now, we do see some of this kind of stuff, especially, I think, lately, because of the pandemic and all that. We're seeing this this kind of idea creep up a little on social media. So I just want to look at some tweets. I think these are from last year. I got these last year. So they're a little pandemic specific, I suppose. But it's pretty interesting how people are using social media and language to try to sort of create a certain reality. So this guy says, coronavirus is not man-made, used by the Dems to impeach Trump, used by the Tories to kill the elderly, anything to do with the Illuminati, right? And in fact, all of these have been floating around and being taken seriously over the last couple of years. Turn off Facebook, turn on brains. That's about as forceful as you can get, a statement about this kind of stuff. What's interesting, though, is that the pandemic itself has kind of made this worse. And that's not unlike what you see throughout history. There's another one. A legitimate public health crisis becomes yet another choose your own reality event, a wedge to amplify divisions. The democratization of online information has created platforms and advertising economies built to reward misinformation. Now, this is going to kill people. That's another ending on a high note, right? Ending on a forceful high note here. It's interesting what Frank Schaeffer is saying here, because he's talking about essentially all of the key elements that we've been talking about, right? The idea that you can choose your own reality, and that how social media might be amplifying this during a time of crisis. And he's specifically relating this to what he calls the democratization of online information. We're going to talk more about that when we read Cass Sunstein's little article later on. But the democratization of online information is part of, at least the idea here is that it's part of why all of this stuff is happening, right? It's pretty interesting how these people are sort of analyzing this, right? What's interesting as well is the democratization of online information. He says it's created these platforms and advertising economies, right? That's just Facebook. Facebook is following an advertising model because what they really want is engagement and connection. Not necessarily connection with you and your long lost cousin, but connection with you in a whole array of products. That's why the last few years you've seen on Facebook much more advertisements for things that you had no idea where they came from. This next one is really interesting to me. This is really, I think, getting at the heart of the problem we've been experiencing the last couple of years. So check out this tweet. This is from somebody whose Twitter handle is sex counseling. So, and she says she's a PhD who has, I guess, a degree in, that kind of, sex therapy or something like that. But this is her tweet. It's a pretty remarkable tweet. The virus is not new. It has been around for a very long time and has had many different strains that are similar to this one. Sure, that's probably true. The coronavirus is not a new virus. Why now are they making this into something bigger than it is? Simpsons in 1993 talking about the coronavirus, right? So you have this thing, this clip with, was it Kent Brockman or whatever, giving the news about the coronavirus. Well, this is just completely made up out of thin air, okay? Either this person herself made it up or she got it from somebody else who made it up. So here's another tweet. LOL, the actual clip. It's sad I even have to do this since people are now using old Simpson episodes to solidify their beliefs. All of you are bonkers, and sadly, there is no vaccine for that. So the original clip was the apocalypse meow. I'm guessing that there was town was overrun by cats. I have no idea what the episode is. But this really exemplifies kind of what we're dealing with. So one question is, well, which one's right, Dawn or Dave, right? She says that this is a clip from 1993 that proves the coronavirus was a talking point back then. He says, no, here's the actual clip, right? Well, one way to check that, going back to a previous slide, is look at Simpsons archive footage. Find the episode, watch the episode. Does it say apocalypse meow or does it say coronavirus? Well, even then, once you're really far along on the road to skepticism, you could doubt both of these. And that's exactly what the 1984 party, as it were, exploits, essentially. I mean, O'Brien pretty explicitly says this in the third part of the book. So a couple of questions here, just kind of going off of some of these tweets. Are there real life situations that would, or can you imagine, that would upend the values that you've always held dear? So for example, a lot of people, if you ask them, well, is there any situation where you could imagine yourself doing, some evil act or whatever, some act that they currently find to be really evil? And a lot of people say, no, there isn't. Well, in history, we find that this is actually largely not the case. So for example, things like pandemics or wars or some other trauma. A famous case from history is in the Peloponnesian War, Athens was overrun by, you guessed it, a disease, right? A plague. And Thucydides writes about this situation saying, look, people just gave up. They gave up caring about any values or morals or anything like this. The reason was they knew that they were going to die, and they just said, screw it, I'm going to go out and do whatever I want. And that's exactly what happened. So we do hold values dear, but sometimes the context might shift what we actually hold dear and what we even believe. Could such situations change our views about human nature, right? Going back to Thucydides, even he does write about that kind of stuff in the context of the plague, right? People who thought that they were good or just and that was part of human nature gave up that idea. Could they change your views about what is just? Again, same kind of thing. Obviously, how are we supposed to navigate this world of disinformation? Just go back to the Simpsons tweet, right? We're in a crisis situation right now, and you have two different sides. One treating it, at least, back then with that tweet, one treating it as, no big deal. This thing has been around for a long time. The other side treating it as, well, this is actually a public health crisis and we should take it seriously. What's really fascinating to me, I guess it's fascinating, I don't know, is that this pandemic has gotten worse. I mean, I think the number that I heard today was thus far worldwide, there's been 5 million deaths. And you still have segments of the population that are doubling down for epistemological reasons, in a sense, right? They have beliefs and they don't want to upset their beliefs. And so they're not getting vaccinated. They're not doing whatever, right? I just saw a video yesterday of a nurse who I guess was fired or something from the hospital because they didn't take her beliefs seriously enough. Well, I'm not sure she takes her beliefs seriously enough, or at least understands them enough to articulate why, a public health crisis has this effect on the way people think. But again, I think social media, of course, is probably part of the context that we're living in that partly explains some of this stuff, right? One of the issues is a lot of this disinformation is in fact coming from us. So that's a disanalogy with 1984, right? 1984, Orwell writes it as this juggernaut of a government with a central leader, et cetera, with crushing policies and all this kind of stuff. Well, we don't really have that. We don't have that. The disinformation is in fact either on purpose or not coming from us, right? If you remember when we talked about Valkenburg and Piotrowski's article last week, we're both consumers and producers when it comes to social media. So we're consuming other people's misinformation, and by retweeting or sharing or whatever, we're also producing it ourselves in a way, right, on the platform itself. So that's a lot of interesting stuff to think about. Again, I think a lot of this philosophical stuff comes out more forcefully in part 3. So in parts 1 and 2, he's kind of just setting the stage. Obviously, part 1 describes kind of the society. Part 2, that's when he's sort of, found out, I think. And then part 3 is more the philosophical element. All right, are there any questions about that kind of introductory stuff? There's more introductory stuff, but it's more relevant to the book before we actually get into the book. Any questions? Remember, I can't read the chat.
Yep, there's no questions in the chat.
Oh, I don't even see a chat button. Oh, well.
Oh, wait, here we go. Ethan asks, does part 3 end on page 37?
What? Part 3 is the very last part of the book, so it ends on page 312.
Yeah, the pagination might differ depending on the publisher and what have you, but part 3 is usually the conclusion of the book as far as 1984 is concerned.
So page 37 is way into part 1, I think. This is the book that I have, if people could see that.
The Dover Classic, is that what that was?
Signet Classic.
Signet Classic, okay.
Somebody's buying all these companies, so I think they're all the same thing at this point, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Doesn't look like it.
All right. So just a little background, some major themes, etc. Here's George Orwell. He died only a couple of years or so after this book came out, actually. And as you can see, relatively young. His real name is Eric Arthur Blair. He's a British writer. And as you can see, 1903 to 1950 is obviously pretty much the totality of the first half of the 20th century. So he saw all of the major sort of world-changing events during this period, right? He's in the thick of it. And being in England, he's especially in the thick of it because they were part of all of this in a more direct way than America was. He opposed the totalitarianism that was growing and rising in Europe in the early 20th century. He was a supporter of democratic socialism in England. Interestingly enough, he's, well, I don't know, you probably don't want to call him Shakespeare, but he's sort of like a 20th century Shakespeare in the sense that a lot of concepts and words from this particular book have entered the English language, right? Similarly with Shakespeare, a lot of phrases that we love and take for granted are actually from Shakespeare. Things like Orwellian, right? You've probably heard that in the last few years or so. What they're usually talking about is this book. But they almost also might be talking about Animal Farm, which discusses similar kinds of topics. Memory hole, that's another one. Thought crime, Big Brother, right? Big Brother is so ubiquitous in our culture right now. There is a game show called Big Brother. The idea there, of course, is that these people in this house are always being watched by who? Big Brother, right? So that idea is taken directly from this book. Some of the major themes, totalitarian government, right? Again, the totalitarian government that you see in this book is much more, I guess, keyed to the kinds of governments that you'd see in the early 20th century, right? Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia. Those are the two big examples, and even East Germany afterwards. What's interesting about East Germany is that I read somewhere recently that their sort of domestic spy program was way more sophisticated than even like the Gestapo in Nazi Germany. So they were really, they were watching everybody. That was real Big Brother stuff. North Korea a little bit later on, similar kind of theme. One of the most interesting themes of the book, I think, is language manipulation and propaganda. Now, that's obviously going to concern us more than, probably more than just pure political kinds of themes. So you have things like newspeak, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that. Manipulation of the past, manipulation of images. Now, note that all three of these are, in fact, Well, number one, all three of these, you can think of them as technologies. Newspeak, a little bit controversially, is the idea of whether language is a technology or has a technological element to it. But manipulation of the past and the manipulation of images, those rely on a kind of technology that Winston Smith, the main character, is essentially in charge of, right? It's his job to sort of manage that kind of thing, essentially to manage propaganda. Another theme here is emotion. Obviously, one of the big emotions we have is fear. You're always fearful about what Big Brother might pick up, right? There's these telescreens or whatever, or anybody who's watching, even your kids, right? You're always fearful that somebody will take something that you've said, even if you didn't mean it in a certain way, interpret it, and then essentially turn you in. So obviously there's a lot of anxiety living in this kind of society. Forbidden love, at the center of the story, is this kind of love story between Winston and Julia. It's interesting because the psychology of this love story takes place within the fear and anxiety of living in this society. So it's kind of a bizarre love story in a way. Another emotion central to the book, I think, is also hate, right? They have this 2 minutes hate thing that they engage in daily, essentially. And we'll see that in a bit. The other major theme is the idea that you can have independent thought or independent knowledge. Independent of what? Well, in the book, at least, independent of the party, right? What can be known with certainty, if anything can be. So tying that to things like social media, how, again, do you navigate disinformation? What resources do we have to tell whether the one lady with her Simpsons tweet is correct or the guy who's challenging her is correct, right? What are the resources that we have for that? And here's another one. Here's an interesting question about this. Is it better or worse to have a sort of super strong central authority manipulating our thoughts, or is it better or worse, I guess, politically, to have it be decentralized and having us essentially doing it to ourselves? That's an interesting, I think, question that has been raised more forcefully, perhaps, in the last few years as this book has gotten popular. And people are trying to say, well, today is not exactly like 1984, but, and then they'll try to, kind of tie some of the themes to what's going on now. So the ones that we're really concerned about would be the language manipulation and propaganda elements and the independent thought elements. So we're going to talk probably more about that on Wednesday when we focus in a little bit more on some of these quote unquote philosophical issues. All right, who are the major characters? I'm not putting every character up here, but here are the major ones. Winston Smith, right? He's the protagonist of the story. He's the guy who, yeah. Hold on a minute. Yeah, he doesn't narrate it really, but he's the main focus of the entire story, right? As I mentioned, he's kind of engaged in propaganda, right? Changing the past, that kind of thing. And that's the function of the Ministry of Truth. And so that's where he works. There is significance in that name. Interestingly enough, Winston Smith himself does display some independence of thought. He's not entirely controlled by the propaganda of the party, perhaps, and this is a really interesting question, I think, perhaps because he's part of it. He's part of disseminating that disinformation. So in a way, could you say that he knows? Well, that theme comes out pretty forcefully in the third part of the book, whether he really does have that kind of independence of thought, because he's saying he does. And he's defending himself by saying, look, I work at this place. I know what I'm talking about. His friend, mentor, not mentor, the guy who's, kind of stalking him, who turns out to be a party leader, challenges him on that in pretty interesting ways. Julia, she's this initially mysterious woman who becomes Winston's lover. Again, it's kind of a forbidden love within this totalitarian context. O'Brien, this is the party member, inner party, part of the inner circle, and he befriends Winston essentially to entrap him. And so then the third part is O'Brien and Winston sort of in this discussion about what the hell, man? Right? What is all this? Emmanuel Goldstein, the leader of the Brotherhood and the supreme enemy of Oceania, which is the society that they live in, right? Winston lives in Oceania. One question here, and again, this is a big question, one that we can relate to social media. Does Goldstein even exist, right? Does this person exist, or are they essentially invented for a specific purpose? And then finally, Big Brother, right? Big Brother is the leader of the party. He's never named. We never see Big Brother. We just call Big Brother Big Brother. So the question then is, does Big Brother even exist? Is Big Brother just a concept, in other words, that the party or whomever is in control, is it a concept that they're using to manipulate people, right? So it's interesting, through the technology, these people, the enemy and the leader, don't even actually have to exist. Think of how that works with social media, right? The concept of the bot, for example. The bot comes in, engages in sort of Turing test language, right? You believe that they're a real person, you're engaging in an argument, or they rile you up somehow. Blah, 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 but they're not real. How do we know this kind of stuff? So that's these are some of the main questions that we're going to be looking at. A little bit of historical context, because I think that that's important, especially for a book like this, which is kind of a historical book, just in the sense of where the context within which it was written. Now, going back to Frankenstein, what's the big historical event? French Revolution. The French Revolution, as I mentioned, was one of my professors says, look, we don't even know if the French Revolution has ended yet. Well, even more forcefully, the question was, had it ended by the time of, say, World War II? Now, a slogan of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, fraternity, right? These three sort of Enlightenment or 18th century philosophical ideals that they thought that they could implement into French society and have this, panacea, this utopia, that kind of thing. A cure for all the years of monarchy that were radically unjust. So what are these three concepts? Well, you can think of liberty as the ability to do as one pleases, I suppose, without harming others, right? This is a pretty standard concept of Enlightenment political theory. Historically, this is aligned with something like American democracy, or eventually some elements of English law. Equality, no one is above anyone else under the law. That's at least the ideal. This also historically has been part of American democracy, but it's not clear at all that it's ever been, realized. But the idea of equality, a sort of across the board equality, is historically aligned with something like classless communism, right? No one is above anyone else, and the idea there is you're getting rid of classes. Again, that probably never really happened either. I mean, it's an ideal, it's never quite achieved. Fraternity, The idea here is the sort of social and political inculcation of a national spirit, right? You want to have a national identity, right? We're British, we're French. In fact, this kind of idea is one of the prime driving forces behind Brexit, right? And the idea that being part of the European Union is somehow eroding the national identity of the people of England, right? That's one of the driving forces behind this. Historically, fraternity, or the idea of fraternity, has been aligned with something like Nazism or fascism, at least in Europe. So what you get from the French Revolution in Europe, at least, is this sort of split along these kind of ideological lines. Now, we can ask ourselves a few different questions here that are related to this. One of the questions I think is really an interesting one, specifically about 1984. But we can ask, why liberty, right? Why do people cherish something like liberty, right? The ability to sort of do what one pleases, right? Because again, there are societies who don't cherish this as a main sort of ideal. Well, perhaps the idea is that it respects people's sort of inherent autonomy or their intrinsic worth, right? You have to accept these kinds of concepts as well. And then you might say liberty is the political concept that respects these other concepts. People have an intrinsic worth. People have an inherent sort of autonomy. Liberty is the idea that captures this. Why equality? In other words, why cherish the quality that no one is above anyone else under the law? Well, again, nobody is intrinsically better than others. This kind of idea, especially when it's put through law, it's supposed to offer a sense of justice and fairness, right? The idea being something like, if Jeff Bezos commits a crime and Johnny Smith down the street commits a crime, they're going to be treated equally, even if Smith doesn't have much money and Bezos is the richest guy in the world, or whatever it is, right? The idea there is that they're not going to be treated dissimilarly by the justice system. And we all know, of course, how that works in practice. Not well. Why fraternity? Why, in other words, try or think that you should inculcate this sort of national spirit within the population? Well, the idea here is that society would kind of devolve into chaos with a lot of different political or cultural values that are constantly competing with each other, right? The idea of factions. Can a society exist when it's so utterly divided into several different factions? And interestingly enough, of course, we're seeing that kind of fragmentation in today's society, where some of the political discussions that you hear and read about are, look, this part of the country just doesn't want to have anything to do with this other part of the country. And, people are talking even about civil war, right? Let's just call it a day and be done with each other, that kind of stuff. But it doesn't stop just with two major parts. Fragmentation can be, split down to individual people, if you want to take it to the logical extreme. But the other question is, and this is the weird one for me, why totalitarianism, right? Why, what do people say about this kind of government, right? What is it? Well, it's basically the political theory that says that the state has absolute central authority and governs and dictates all aspects of our social and political life. So the idea traditionally, at least with fascism, is that the individual doesn't really matter intrinsically, right? They are essentially just a part or a cog, as it were, of the state machine. So their value is as part of this greater whole. And the, whoever's in charge in a totalitarian government, usually it's a single person, they're the ones through which all of this national identity sort of emanates out. I mean, they're almost treated as gods or kings or whatever, but it's different from monarchy in a sense. The question is why? Why, other than to give, this leader or whatever absolute power, right? They certainly might like it, but why would other people buy into this? Well, there's three basic reasons that have been put forth, right? Cultural values, for example, are indexed to specific cultures. And so you have this idea of cultural relativism, right? Different cultures have legitimate value systems that might be completely different from other cultures, but this is where we get the idea of the national interest, the national spirit, right? You have to cultivate your own culture's values. Secondly, culture is a part of the social life of the nation, right? This is the idea of nationalism. So different cultures have different values, and the idea is to amplify your culture's values as much as you can, because that's essentially the foundation of the social life of the society. Finally, the state is really this is the theory, the state is the only thing that can uphold all of this stuff, right? This is the idea of statism. So the state is the only political entity that can, in fact, push and inculcate any given culture or country's cultural values, right? So that's the theory, right? You perhaps heard of the phrase the benevolent dictator, right? That's, of course, the ideal of a totalitarian country. You have this benevolent dictator who is in fact correct about all of this stuff, and then they design or run their society accordingly. Of course, that almost never happens, right? The problem here is it's difficult to maintain all three of these things within a single society. France, of course, in the revolution tried that and immediately pretty much started killing each other, right? The terror, the reign of terror and all that kind of stuff. So again, one reason, just historically speaking, why you don't find all of these perfectly sort of balanced in any given society is that it's difficult. And so you just have different societies sort of emphasizing one concept over the other in some sort of balance, perhaps, but they're always emphasizing at least one over all the others. All right, so that's a little historical context. Totalitarianism, again, Orwell's writing within the context of these rising sort of nationalistic, authoritarian ideals, again, in Europe. Oceania is going to be one of these, or it's going to be similar to the kinds of things that Orwell was witnessing in his real life, right? This book came out in, what, 48? Few years after World War II ended, but obviously he lived through all that. He lived through World War I. He lived through the chaos between the wars, the depression, the economic anxieties and other things of Europe during this period. So let's look at the institutions of Oceania, which again is a totalitarian government of a specific kind. So you have these four ministries, right? They're essentially the main sort of political institutions of the country. The first is the Ministry of Truth. What is this responsible for? Rewriting the past, of course. It's responsible for propaganda and all news and entertainment. So anything that you're getting through your telescreens, for example, comes from the Ministry of Truth. Again, this is where Winston works. The Ministry of Plenty, it's responsible for rationing food and other supplies and goods. The Ministry of Peace, responsible for carrying out wars. One other element of reality versus appearances from this book is, are there actually wars going on, right? That's one thing that you can question. Finally, the Ministry of Love, responsible for torturing and rehabilitating political dissidents, right? These are all examples of Orwell's concept of doublethink, which is essentially entertaining a contradiction in your mind and believing it to be true. This comes from a sort of political indoctrination and linguistic manipulation that's also a major part of the 1984 society. Now, it's interesting because, again, unlike today, in the book, everything comes from this sort of centralized, government. At least that's, what we're led to believe. And what's interesting here is that just the names of these institutions are embodiments of some of this political philosophy of the party itself. So the more that you hear something like the Ministry of Truth, the more you're going to associate it with propaganda. The more in your mind, you're going to associate the concept of truth with propaganda, rewriting the past, et cetera, et cetera. Similarly with all the three other institutions, right? The Ministry of Plenty is responsible for cutting down on food, rationing it. The main ideology of this society, Ingsoc, right? English socialism. This is the party's political philosophy. Now, there's a graphic for you. Now, the principles of Ingsoc are outlined in what Orwell, it's like a book within a book. In 1984, the theory and practice of oligarchical socialism, right? And I do mean that as a book in a book, because there is a section, I believe it's in part 2, yeah, it says there, where Orwell is giving you what this quote unquote real person, Emmanuel Goldstein, wrote, right? He gives you part of this actual book. So you do get some of the principles of the party, right? Now, there are 3 main slogans as well, right? Not sure exactly where this comes from, but whatever. You'll notice that Big Brother here kind of looks like Hitler, all right? Probably deliberate. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Now, these examples, these slogans are similar to, in their function and in their effect, of the names of the institutions of Oceania, right? They're examples of doublethink in a way, right? The first concept is, in a sense, the negation of the second one, or it undermines it in some way. So war is peace, war and peace are opposites. Freedom is slavery, freedom and slavery are opposites. Ignorance is strength. Now, those aren't exactly opposites, but what is one of the slogans that people always hear? Knowledge is power, right? Well, again, it's sort of undermining that concept here. What's interesting here is that O'Brien actually does say that there's a way to interpret these slogans and perhaps even the institutions as non-contradictory or somehow consistent. And some of that comes out in this theory and practice of oligarchical socialism book, where, again, he's talking about this Goldstein author is talking about the theory here. But in part 3, O'Brien himself kind of discusses some of these issues. And we can actually relate it to a lot of what's going on today, which we will. All right, any questions so far about any of this stuff? These are just things that pertain to, the plot, basically, so far.
Any questions on the ideologies of Oceania? Blake asks, are the telescreens actually screens, or are they just a microphone? I couldn't get that from the text.
Good question. They're both, actually, and they're They're two-way screens, so, Zoom, I guess. That's scary. Yeah, they're two-way screens, and they are really powerful microphones, and there are people always watching. And the thing is that they're sophisticated enough that they can pick up intent, right? And that's the really scary part. They can pick up ostensibly what you're thinking. But yeah, they are both screens and microphones.
I don't know why that reminds me of the projects that came out the last 2 years, where it's sort of a repetition of something old called physiognomy, where cameras using algorithmic, sort of very problematic and flawed algorithms, but they use algorithms to denote certain moral qualities or certain qualities of people based solely on their appearance and nothing else. And I'm like,
that's interesting. I didn't know about that.
We don't need to go back to physiognomy.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, that was another early 20th century ideology associated with fascism, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, it was.
Yeah. All right, so let's now talk about some of those technologies, because they are pretty interesting. The first one, again, Winston is sort of in charge of this, the memory hole, right? His main tool for his job, basically. What is it? Well, it's kind of a hole in the wall with a little gate on it that you send paper down. You open the thing, there's a big flame, and you send the paper down. It's, of course, a little primitive to, when compared to what we have. But the idea here is eliminating any sort of information that you don't want anyone else to know. Well, what if they've already read it? Well, the idea there is, no, you haven't. No, you haven't. You just think that you have. And we'll get to that. That comes out much more forcefully in part 3. We'll also show some clips from the movie that might be disturbing for some people. So I'll, obviously warn you when the time comes. But there's some good clips that kind of allow you to visualize how some of this stuff works. The memory hole as a technology is a tool, basically, for rewriting the past to fit the government's whatever they're currently accepting as their narrative of what's real, right? So if you don't want people to believe some event that happened yesterday and was reported in the papers, you get rid of those papers and you put out a new paper, and you just say, this is the paper that always existed, right? It's pretty interesting how they think that they can get away with that, because they can, at least as Orwell is sort of structuring this. Here's a tweet. Ron Johnson did not merely float bizarre counterfactual conspiracy theories about provocateurs and false flags. He did it in the most witless way imaginable. The idea, or the reason I'm putting this tweet up here, is that you can see an Orwellian concept in action, right? I believe this is an article written by conservative commentator Charlie Sykes, but he's using this concept here to sort of criticize or critique what a politician, his response to, I think, the January 6th thing or whatever. But he's using that concept. Other technologies, as we just mentioned, the telescreens, these are two-way screens. They disseminate propaganda just like any TV screen would, but they also monitor and record people's behavior, both visually and audibly, right? So they're the main source of what we might call electronic surveillance in the book. But you also have things like the spies, right? So there's electronic surveillance, and Winston, you have to do daily calisthenics in your house or whatever, and Winston, is slagging off a little bit. So the instructor in the studio is watching, or has somebody watching for her, and she says, Winston, stand up straight, get those knees up, that kind of thing. So they literally are two ways. But that's not all, of course. You do want human people to be watching out for everyone else. This sometimes takes the form of children, right? just like it did in Nazi Germany. Another one is related to, the technology. Here's the idea of the 2 minutes hate. This is a sort of daily telescreen propaganda film. So I have a couple of interesting little pictures here. Here's people involved, engaged in the 2 minutes hate, right? And then they're making the, you can think of that as sort of the Heil Hitler, thing in Nazi Germany. That's just Oceania's version of this. Here's the sort of big telescreens that they're watching, and that's a picture of Big Brother, apparently. But let's actually watch a clip if we can, if this works. Let's try it. So this is a clip basically of all those pictures. And the woman you see right in front of you right now is Julia.
But even as we grow,
can people hear that?
Yep.
Great.
of victory, there is a cancer, an evil tumor, growing, spreading in our midst. Shout! Shout! Shout out his name!
Nothing the party does is good. Even the world stands is good. The party wants you to believe we have a war, so as to turn your emotions away from their rightful
So what's interesting about that clip, if you notice, obviously it's just a bunch of screaming for a couple of minutes or whatever, but the guy on the screen is Goldstein. And they're encouraged, of course, to yell death and all this other stuff at this image of Goldstein, who's, again, we don't know if he's real. It could be an actor in a studio. It seems that the 1984 propaganda element runs on a whole series of what we might call Reichstag events, right? Things that the government does to make you think that something nefarious is happening. Well, the 2 minutes hate is just an embodiment of that every single day. You go there and you scream and you watch this Goldstein person. What's interesting is that at the end, they're sort of superimposing images of violence, ostensibly the enemy or something like that, over Goldstein. And that's really, you got to get riled up there. It abruptly ends, and the, Ingsoc theme or whatever, the triumphant music comes on, and everybody, falls to their knees in, ecstasy or whatever. It's a ritualistic performance entirely designed to get your mind focused on what the party wants you to focus on. The next technology, though, is really interesting, I think, Newspeak, right? So Newspeak is an artificial language. entirely designed to control our thoughts, right? To control what can and cannot be thought. So the idea there is, if you can just invent or reinvent language, since thought, when you have thoughts, they're through language, just have a very limited kind of vocabulary, which will limit your thoughts, right? It's this concept of diminishing vocabulary in such a way that you not only get rid of words, but eventually you'll make it a thought crime to even think those words, right? So this guy, Syme, he says, don't you see that he's in charge of this, he's rewriting it, or he's at least one of the workers working on Newspeak. He says, don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it, right? In the meantime, if they get rid of a word and you do in fact think it, that's thought crime. But the idea there is to get rid of thought crime. Get rid of people's ability at all to have, say, the kinds of thoughts that might go against the party. That's a pretty interesting philosophical idea as well. So the idea here is that you're using language, or you're using language manipulation as this technology to control our thoughts. Quite clearly, I think that that's an issue today in terms of, this kind of social media language that has been developing. We'll come back to this a little bit more when we read Talia Lavin's article, because she has an example of this 11-year-old girl who's just this total fascist using this weird language that I can't even read it. But that's part of this technology. That's part of what's going on now. But it ain't coming from the government. Here's a really interesting thing. I don't know if any of you have heard of this guy, Frank Luntz. He's basically a focus group kind of person who does these focus groups to choose specific kinds of language for his political clients. And most of them have been Republicans over the last, 30, 40 years. And what he does is he goes in and he does these focus groups and he figures out the precise language that his clients will need to use to sell the ideas or ideologies that they want to sell. So he's the guy behind changing the estate tax to, instead of calling it the death tax, right? Well, because everybody hates death. So you want to get rid of the death tax, right? And that's a perfect use of language manipulation. Well, if you remember the passage from Plato last time, we can kind of compare what these two guys are doing, right? So Frank Luntz says, look, I examine every side of the issue from every perspective. But more importantly, I listen to the American people and what they want. Maybe that's why my memos attract so much attention. It's really the language of America. Remember when Socrates was talking last week, knowing nothing in reality about which of these convictions or appetites is fine or shameful, good or bad, just or unjust, he uses all these terms in conformity with the great beast's belief, calling the things it enjoys good and the things that anger it bad. Isn't that exactly what Frank Luntz seems to be doing here, right? Well, this is the language of America. Whether it's good or bad is irrelevant. This is just what they want, and I'm going to feed it to them. I'm going to feed them, I'm going to use their current desires, whether they're good or bad, and use that to come up with new linguistic concepts that we can use for political manipulation. Well, Plato was talking about this 2,500 years ago, and Orwell was talking about this in the 1940s. Just a couple of other examples of Newspeak, not Newspeak, but 1984 Today. This, I think, is an interesting example of 1984 Today in terms of linguistic manipulation. But there's other fairly obvious ones as well. number one, there's an increase in sort of overt surveillance, right? You've probably seen these things around campus. What are those? I think these started out in casinos, but they're basically cameras watching every little thing that goes on. There's also an increase in covert surveillance, right? So you might even start to question some of your own devices, right? I don't know what the first one is, but the second one's Alexa. Where's my phone? You have Alexa on, in your living room or whatever. Is Alexa recording your conversations? Well, I think there have been studies, or somebody looked into this and said that it can do that, and in some instances might be doing that, ostensibly because it wants to know what you're thinking about in terms of products, but not everybody's talking about products all the time. So that might be a little scary. Another thing that's really interesting, and this is specifically from Facebook, is this headline that I came up with or found last year. Facebook knows how to track you using the dust on your camera lens. What? Well, they haven't, according to when this article was written, they haven't actually used this technology. But the idea is the dust on your camera lens, or the dust particles or something, what they can do is compare that to other people's cameras and dust particles or whatever, and make a judgment. The algorithm makes a judgment about whether you should connect with that person. So I read this article, and one of the examples was, say you're in a bar and you're talking to someone, and you're not connected on Facebook. Well, this technology, the person said, could be used to have both of you show up in your own Facebook, feeds or whatever it is, people you may know, that kind of thing, just through this technology. And what it does is it connects specific people who might have been, flirting at the bar or whatever, and excludes other people just by the dust on your camera lens. I have no idea how that works, but it's pretty scary is what it is. It's pretty Orwellian, to use that word. Couple of other technologies that obviously I think people would naturally sort of understand. What about telescreens? Does anyone, I haven't updated this apparently, but Skype, WhatsApp, tracking likes on Facebook is even a sort of similarity to the telescreen, but also Zoom. Obviously, we've been inundated with Zoom over the last year. That's two-way. It's a little different, of course, because there's no central authority or anything kind of using Zoom or whatever, but two-way screens, right? I think here, tracking of likes on Facebook is the most similar to the telescreens in a way. What about something like the never-ending wars, right? We'll talk a little bit more about this next time, but the very concept of these never-ending wars is related to the concept of propaganda, right? So we have today the war on terror, right? Well, is sort of conceived as, intrinsically, perpetual in a way. Doublethink, there's a couple of examples here, like shutting down Planned Parenthood in the service of women's health. The common thought that there's no truth, for example, while somehow maintaining that this statement is itself true. That would be a sort of meta example of doublethink. Alternative facts, right? We've heard of these kinds of things in the news. Patriots undermining the very country that they love. Anything that sort of has this kind of almost tenor-esque element to it. This notion that one part of the thing negates the other part or undermines the other part. Newspeak, well, just look at the internet, right? LOL, OMG, IMHO. I believe there's probably a few new ones. I can never keep up with half of them. But these are some of the kinds of things, and you'll notice that a lot of this is, coming from things like the internet and social media, these sort of Orwellian themes that we can find today. There's also, of course, just good old-fashioned media manipulation, right? Here's a couple of pretty disturbing examples, actually. So here's one, the actual photos on the right, and then the graphics department, apparently, at Fox News, put the other one on the air instead. You'll notice how they drastically manipulated the original photo. They did the same thing to another person. The reason why they did this is apparently these two people were critiquing various things about Fox News, and obviously they're not going to stand for that. So this is what they do, right? You're doctoring photos, obviously, as a way to sort of sway an audience to your purpose as against their purpose, their critique, something like that.